When a young homeless man found himself cold and hungry, he encountered his savior, Dennis Nilsen. Upon following the Good Samaritan home, the poor guy was relieved to find a warm dinner waiting at a table. The two men chatted all night. It was truly a faith restored in humanity kind of moment for the homeless young man. However, little did he know, he was eating his last supper at the house of a Muswell Hill murderer. The Good Samaritan was no other than Dennis Nilsen, a British serial killer who killed at least 12 men and boys between 1978 and 1983. His victims were mainly homeless gay men or young men from broken homes who he met at bars or on the street. He would lure them to his apartment, where he would strangle or drown them before disposing of their bodies. He then kept their remains in his home as trophies, sometimes even boiling them down in order to keep them. He was eventually caught after human remains were discovered blocked in a drain outside his home. Today, we will be talking about the infamous serial killer Dennis Nilsen. Before we get into the gruesome murderer's tale, please click on the like and subscribe button. With that out of the way, let's move on with the video. Early life. Dennis Nilsen was born in Fraserburgh, Scotland in 1945. He had a difficult childhood with an emotionally distant mother and a father who was frequently absent due to his job as a policeman. Nilsen himself worked various jobs before joining the army at the age of 18. He served in the military police for several years before being honorably discharged. After leaving the army, Nilsen worked as a police constable and later as a civilian clerk for the police. He also worked as a security guard and a civil servant. Throughout his life, Nilsen struggled with feelings of isolation and loneliness and had a history of problematic relationships. This ambitious young man's peers had no idea that in the future, this seemingly good man would take the lives of innocent men. The Muswell Hill murderer. Dennis Nilsen began murdering in 1978, shortly after he moved into a flat at 23 Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill area of London. His first known victim was a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes, whom he met while working as a security guard at a local job center. Nilsen strangled Holmes and then kept his body in his flat for several days before disposing of it. Over the next few years, Nilsen continued to lure men and boys to his flat, where he would kill them and then keep their remains. He would often act as a good Samaritan, offering to help them with food, shelter, and even job opportunities. He also frequented bars and pubs where he would meet his victims. Nilsen's motives for killing are not entirely clear. It is believed that he murdered others for a variety of reasons. One reason may have been his desire for companionship and a need to control and manipulate others. He also had a fascination with death and may have been driven to kill in order to experience the feeling of power and control over his victims. Some even speculated that Dennis may have suffered from some form of mental illness or personality disorder that contributed to his violent behavior. However, dear viewers, it is important to note that the criminal mind is complex and it is difficult to identify a single cause for someone's actions. Fun fact, or maybe not, but did you know Dennis Nilsen earned the title of Muswell Hill murderer because most of his killing spree was carried out in the Muswell Hill area of London? Spooky. Serial killer Dennis Nilsen's method of killing. Dennis Nilsen was truly twisted and sinister. He killed his victims in a variety of ways, most commonly by strangling or drowning them. When he strangled his victims, he would use different methods such as using his hands, ligatures, or cords. He would brutally choke his prey until they passed out and then would check if they were still alive. If they were not, he would proceed to physically assault the cold corpse. He was a necrophile. In some cases, he even drowned his victims in a bathtub or sink. The stories are simply cold and nerve-wracking. Sometimes, Nilsen would hold the heads of his victims underwater until they died. Plus, he would make the death even more painful by using a combination of strangling and drowning. Chills. Death wouldn't be the final abode for Nilsen's many victims. The serial killer had a thing for keeping his victims' dead bodies in his flat for several days, sometimes even weeks, before disposing them. He would often clean and dress the bodies, and in some cases, he would try to preserve them by boiling them in an attempt to prevent decomposition. It's important to note that Nilsen's actions were extremely brutal and gruesome, and his victims suffered greatly before their death. Victims. Dennis Nilsen is believed to have killed at least 12 men and boys between 1978 and 1983. However, the exact number of victims is not known, as some remains were never identified. His victims were mainly homeless gay men or young men from broken homes who he met at bars or on the street. Here are a few of his known victims. Stephen Holmes, 14-year-old boy whom Nilsen met while working as a security guard at a local job center. He strangled him and then kept his body in his flat for several days before disposing of it. Martin Duffy, a 16-year-old boy whom Nilsen met at a bar and invited back to his flat. He drowned him in a sink and kept his body in his flat for several days before disposing of it. Kenneth O'Kendon, a 23-year-old man whom Nilsen met at a bar. He drowned him in a bathtub and kept his body in his flat for several days before disposing of it. William Sutherland, a 32-year-old man whom Nilsen met at a bar. He strangled him and then kept the body in his flat for a few days before dumping it somewhere. Malcolm Barlow, a 24-year-old man with a learning disability whom Nilsen met on the street. Again, he drowned the poor guy in a bathtub and then kept the body in his flat for several days before burying it somewhere. It's truly tragic that these poor men had to experience such a fate at the hands of a ruthless killer. Remember, these victims were all individuals with their own life stories and families, and Nilsen's actions caused immense pain and suffering for their loved ones. The killer is finally caught. As with most serial killers' cases, Nilsen's killing spree went unnoticed for several years, as he was able to conceal the bodies without drawing attention. However, on February 9, 1983, a plumber discovered human remains blocked in a drain outside Nilsen's flat. This finding led to the arrest of the Muswell Hill murderer. When police officers arrived at the scene, they found a large amount of human remains in the drain and traced it back to Nilsen's flat. They searched the flat and found more human remains, including bones and internal organs, as well as evidence of his crimes such as blood stains and cutting board. Almost immediately, Nilsen was arrested at the scene. The accused initially denied any involvement in the murders. However, during questioning, Nilsen eventually confessed to killing at least 12 men and boys. He also led the police to a number of other locations where he had disposed of remains, including a nearby park and a property he previously rented. After his arrest, Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. In October 1983, Dennis Nilsen's trial finally began. During the trial, he pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, but the jury found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. While serving his sentence, Dennis Nilsen died in prison on May 12, 2018 of natural causes. Nilsen's case was one of the most notorious and shocking in British criminal history. His actions were brutal and gruesome, and his arrest and trial brought to light the extent of his crimes and the pain and suffering he caused to his victims and their families. It's chilling how the Muswell Hill murderer ruthlessly killed off men who were at their most vulnerable. This case truly shocks even true crime fans because of its utmost brutally and inhumane intentions. This British serial killer and necrophile not only took away the lives of those poor men, but showed them the worst in humanity. Dennis Nilsen's method of killing is beyond evil. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below.